Hello, thank you for joining us at Washington Talk. I'm Soo Kim. U.S. President Joe Biden issued a proclamation on National Korean War Veterans Armistice Day, saying the selfless American service members helped forge the enduring alliance between the United States and South Korea. Meanwhile, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un threatened the U.S. and South Korea with a possible use of nuclear weapons, unleashing fiery rhetoric against the two countries. Today, we'll discuss these and more.
Any additional nuclear test that the DPRK conducts would carry tremendous costs.
미국과의 그 어떤 군사적 충돌에도 대처할 철저한 준비가 되어 있다는 것을 다시금 확언합니다. 윤석열 정권과 그의 군대는 전면도할 것입니다.
In the studio with me is Scott Snyder, Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Snyder has authored numerous books on the Korean Peninsula, with the latest being South Korea at the Crossroads. Also joining me is Soo Kim, Policy Analyst at the RAND Corporation. Dr. Kim served as an analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency and worked at the Department of Homeland Security. Welcome to the program. Good to have you both today.
Thanks for having us.
First of all, in his proclamation for the Korean War Armistice Day, President Biden underscored the U.S. and South Korea are maintaining an enduring alliance and said South Korea is the United States' strong ally. Mr. Snyder, when he said strong ally, he does mean it goes beyond the military alliance we have seen traditionally since the Korean War.
Well, I think so. And when you step back and look at the alliance in broad perspective, we've seen a tremendous transformation from the time of the Korean War and armistice, from a patron-client relationship where the U.S. was doing virtually everything to provide for South Korean security, to one in which the U.S. and South Korea work together as partners, and increasingly in many places around the world. And so that is a significant difference, and it changes the complexion of the alliance from one that was purely one way to a situation in which the U.S. and South Korea are working in a two-way relationship, where both sides can help each other to meet international security needs.
So, Dr. Kim, the alliance has evolved into the relationship as Mr. Snyder described, that two-way relationship helping each other. Is that right?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on what Mr. Snyder said about it's no longer a one-direction alliance, and I think the realities of geopolitics that we're dealing with today. We have COVID, we have the Russia-Ukraine war, we have U.S.-China competition with supply chains. It's no longer possible for the alliance to just be focused on security issues, and as the president has recently highlighted, we're talking more about economic security, and we cannot win any competition with any country if you're solely focused on just the military aspect. So yes. One thing I noticed was that the president's recent call with the SQ chairman and his staff really underscored, of course, the economic component, but it also highlighted what it would be bringing back to the United States. And this was, I think, in view of the ongoing U.S.-China competition. He mentioned that whereas these opportunities were going to China before, it's actually coming to the United States. And he highlighted various aspects of economic insecurities that the United States was feeling: inflation, job losses, electric batteries, and so many things that are going to, in the long run, I think, affect both U.S. and South Korean interests. So again, there's, I think, no way to really avoid focusing on or giving more time to economic issues than what we're doing right now.
U.S. and South Korea's defense ministers met this week in Washington, and the most important issues to be discussed between the two sides seems to be the extended deterrence and how to implement it. Mr. Snyder, U.S. and South Korea are seeking to speed up their meetings for the extended deterrence strategy and consultation group. How would you relate that to the overall alliance development?
Well, in some ways, I think that the hardest area to show partnership on actually is the issue of extended deterrence. And yet, even in those discussions, I think that part of what is being discussed is how to bridge the difference between the U.S. global non-proliferation perspective and the South Korean sense of vulnerability related to North Korea's nuclear weapons acquisition. And so that's the reason why this dialogue is so important, is that gap has to be bridged in some way, and it's going to have to be bridged in a fashion that helps to address some of the South Korean very real concerns about vulnerability to blackmail that comes from the fact that North Korea has that capability and South Korea does not.
And all these moves between the U.S. and South Korea will be watched very closely, not only by North Korea, but also by China, especially given that South Korea was and still is very dependent on China for its trade. Mr. Snyder, how do you think the closer overall ties between the U.S. and South Korea will affect the dynamics between the U.S. and China?
Well, that's a complicated question. I think that it's and it's kind of complicated because it's been a slow-moving development. But I think that what we see is that South Korea has very clearly made steps in aligning itself with the United States in a context where the U.S. and China are engaged in rather intense rivalry. And I think that where that really puts pressure on South Korea is that it still has all of these stakes and interaction with China, and yet there are expectations for greater alignment on the agenda that the U.S. has essentially set up. And so this is, I think, one of the most interesting and complicated areas that the Yoon administration faces, is how to frame South Korea's relationship with China. And over the course of the past week, I think we've seen even greater potential risk of mismatch because the Chinese are going back to and reinforcing their belief that South Korea should adhere to the 3 no's under the Moon administration. And I think the Yoon administration, for the most part, had already moved past that. So it's going to be very interesting to see how South Korea and China are able to frame the basis for a productive relationship under these circumstances.
I do think that from South Korea's perspective, even investing in U.S. plants has implications just beyond the economics. And we do see the Yoon administration being more, I would say, less gun-shy about slowly pivoting towards the United States over China. But I think we do have to sort of manage expectations when it comes to where South Korea is, because recently I think South Korea's has to basically decide whether or not it wants to join the Chip 4 alliance. And that, from South Korea's perspective, they want to frame it as an economic initiative, but it's much more. And there's sensitivities about Chinese retaliation, commercial suicide and so forth. So while I think the anticipation and the expectation is high for South Korea to not just slowly wean itself off from China, but to actually dramatically make that departure, I think the reality is the corporations, the South Korean government is going to, as much as they want to take that leap, it's going to take time for that adjustment to actually happen. I think that the latest meeting that we saw between President Biden and the SK chairman was notable because you don't really see a U.S. president taking the time investing the time to reach out to these executives. And I think, from a kind of a skeptical lens too, you have to think about how much pressure South Korea is also feeling, I think, at this point. But I think if Korea is actually wanting to improve its relations with the United States, And if President Yoon is truly sincere about making, his global pivotal state a reality, then that risk and the cost is something that, they will have to bear in the short term. But I think at the long term, it's going to put South Korea in a much better place, down the road. Not just dealing with China, but all of these other complications that we're seeing around the world.
In the meantime, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un himself lashed out at the United States and South Korea, and even using some crude words. And then he indicated he could use nuclear weapons if necessary against the US and South Korea. Mr. Snyder, so once again, North Korea is threatening the US and South Korea with their nuclear weapons. It doesn't seem like there have been much change in that aspect, are they?
Well, I understand why you're saying that, but I do think that one thing that we are beginning to see this week is the potential emergence of an effort by North Korea to link a possible future nuclear test to the military exercises that the US and South Korea are going to be revitalizing over the course of the next few weeks. And I think that that is very interesting and complex because the diminishing of the exercises occurred as a result of symmetry between Kim and Trump. That is long in the rearview mirror, and there's not necessarily a justification for continuing that kind of muted approach. And yet it seems like the North Koreans are trying to use their nuclear capabilities or the possibility of an additional provocation as a coercive means by which to influence U.S. South Korea decisions on military exercises or to justify its decision to go forward. And so that's where I think that the situation maybe is a little bit different in terms of what we're seeing from North Korea from a strategic perspective.
Interesting. Dr. Kim, how did you take what Kim Jong-un said?
So I do agree with the State Department in saying that this is really not any, it's not categorically different from what we would expect from North Korea. What I was, I guess, encouraged to see was how the United States was responding. Of course, we're not going after North Korea with tougher sanctions, from a more practical perspective. But I think the fact that the United States is trying to take this at a more, shall we say, a leisurely pace when it comes to dealing with North Korea, not reacting to every provocation, I think shows, hopefully, that the United States is taking this more seriously as a long-term issue and not one that's weighted by political motivations or a timeline that is really, frankly, the timeline is actually up to Kim Jong-un, and it already has been. So it's not surprising to see the comments, the responses, and I think what we should be looking for at this time is if and when North Korea does conduct a test, how will the United States and South Korea respond? And I think that will be key.
The United States and South Korea agreed to resume major field training in August. Mr. Snyder, the joint exercise between the two allies is aimed at defending themselves from the North Korean attacks, but North Korea constantly uses these as a pretext to their more provocations. Will they do that again this time?
I think that seems to be where North Korea might go. A lot of it depends on exactly what the precise timing of the test might be. And so I think that, if we see something happen over the course of the next 3 or 4 weeks, then probably it's going to be used as a pretext. But we're also getting into a space where it's challenging for North Korea because China has some major domestic events going on. And I'm not sure whether North Korea can fully afford to offend China. And so it's a delicate balance, I think, in terms of, we'll never be able to predict precisely when a North Korean nuclear test might occur. But I do think that these situational factors have a bearing on how North Korea handles the situation.
What about you, Dr. Kim? Do you expect to see some provocation after or around the time that U.S. and South Korea conducts exercises?
So the thing is, we've been trying to predict when North Korea is going to conduct a nuclear test for several months. And I guess the surprising element is it hasn't happened. There might be some sort of North Korea pegging the exercises to a justification for tests. So I guess the best thing we can say is that we should be prepared for that eventuality. And again, I think what's most important is not just in our ability to predict and say that's it, but to actually have measures that clearly communicate to the North Koreans that there are consequences. And thus far, I think the responses that North Korea has not seen have not been costly enough for Kim Jong-un to say, maybe I should reconsider, and maybe, there's probably a very, very slim chance that North Korea is going to denuclearize, but at least have that capability to suppress Kim Jong-un's desires to provoke and to basically just keep raising the stakes and to increase his own leverage if and when there's another time to negotiate with the United States.
Mr. Snyder brought up a very interesting issue about China. How do you see the China factor? Because it is Xi Jinping, indeed, he's preparing a big event to cement his leadership. And do you think North Korea feel pressured by it not to agitate or anger the Chinese leadership?
I would say that in the grand scheme of North Korean nuclear ambitions, maybe not, but I think in the short term, because of everything else that's taking place, North Korea does have to be mindful of how, not just the response, but is China going to have North Korea's back when it does decide to test, and the United States and South Korea, Japan, and so forth do respond? Is China going to be there for North Korea? And China has not been supportive of sanctions against North Korea, so those big measures, maybe it won't matter. But I think if Kim Jong-un is playing his cards carefully, and if he is trying to be more conservative, I think, in his decision making, then the China factor would have to play significantly in his decision to provoke. Yeah.
Mr. Snyder, can we continue a little bit more about China? President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping had a phone call, and it isn't clear so far whether the two leaders discussed North Korea. The official, their press release or their briefing, they didn't mention North Korea, whether North Korea was discussed. Do you think they should have discussed more openly about North Korean issue?
I would have liked to have seen North Korea mentioned as part of the public readout from that conversation, in part because I think that the absence of mention of North Korea may confirm some North Korean assumptions that, in fact, the US and China may not be able to cooperate sufficiently to impose costs on a potential nuclear test. And I think the danger of that is also reinforces a North Korean assumption that the Biden administration simply does not have sufficient tools by which to respond in ways that can hurt North Korea at this time.
Wow.
Yeah, so the thing is, I wonder if Biden and Xi actually had the space to talk about North Korea. It should have figured as one of the topics. But their focus seems to be on each other. So while there's a litany of items that they need to talk about with the economy, with democracy, transparency, and so forth, I think we can make the assumption that unless the dynamics change completely, we're unlikely to see a US-China cooperation over North Korea in the near future, I would say.
Then we'll move back to South Korea. The South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and his team are working on the North Korea approach, which is called Audacious Plan. And the details of this plan are expected to come out next month. Yoon's office said they're seeking to coordinate with the United States before announcing the details of this plan. And U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland was in Seoul this week, partly to meet with South Korea's top nuclear envoy, Kim Gun, and talked about Yoon administration's North Korean policy. Mr. Snyder, how is President Yoon's this audacious plan is received in Washington?
Well, I don't think that we know yet because the consultations are yet to occur. And so I think there's going to be a lot of curiosity about that because so far between the Yoon and Biden administration, there has been a lot of focus on deterrence and there's been lip service to diplomacy. And this really represents the first moment for the Yoon administration to provide a framework that would be related to engagement of North Korea. And I think the Biden administration has followed a dual track, deterrence and diplomacy track. And so in that respect, there's probably going to be an openness to hearing what the Yoon administration might have to say on this front. And I think that it also presents a challenge for the Yoon administration in the sense that for most people, when they hear audacious plan, and they think about Yoon's campaign statements, they're probably using as the baseline the Lee Myung-bak administration approach, the denuclearization and normalization 3000 approach. And so there's going to be interest in whether or not the Yoon administration can lean further forward and whether they can find something that might actually click with the North Koreans.
Dr. Kim, the audacious plan, what do you think there needs to be coordinated between the US and South Korean side before they come out with details?
Agreeing with Scott in that we don't really know what that plan entails. But what I want to pick up on is that I'm wondering what assumptions the South Korean government is making by presenting this audacious plan, because it entails an economic component that, is the basis of this is that North Korea, there's going to be a desire by North Korea to denuclearize. We don't see that given the indications. So they're investing a ton of resources right now, based on what I can tell, telling the Unification Ministry to basically sketch out the contours of this plan. It's a lot of resources to be investing if you don't really know where North Korea stands. So the concern I have is that while South Korea and the United States have a general understanding that the ultimate goal is denuclearization, are the steps to getting there actually the same? And is the audacious plan, it's a very appropriate word, I think, but is this audacious plan, is there any substance? And what are the costs that are going to be imposed? Let's put aside South Korea, but the United States as well, and the cost to the alliance, because we're heading in a trajectory where things are looking pretty good for the United States and South Korea with, just expanding the alliance, making it more multidimensional, and it's great. But, the risk of proposing this plan without really knowing if the two countries are clearly aligned, I think will present some, opportunities for forcing bumps down the road.
So I think the fundamental challenge that both sides face is that we're talking about a set of economic benefits potentially that are contingent on security compromises. That North Korea really frames its approach to the world based on a security-first approach. And so what is the basis upon which we can expect progress? I mean, even the Trump administration dangled the idea of investing in resorts on North Korea's east coast as the as the major incentive for North Korea to move on denuclearization. But unless you address the core security needs that North Korea feels in an adequate way that moves them away from reliance on nuclear capability for their security, it's hard to see where it's going to get traction.
A new addition to the Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. was unveiled on Korean War Armistice Day. Now the names of more than 43,000 U.S. service members and Korean augmentees to the U.S. Army who sacrificed their lives defending the freedom of Korea are now part of the memorial. Mr. Snyder and Dr. Kim, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.